The stories we tell gives away a lot about us. Our stories betray our heart, even when we try to keep our heart hidden. They show the secrets of what we value, what we think is right, what we think is wrong. They show the desires we have and the expectations and hopes for the future. We're thinking this week, like I've said, about the question of identity. Who am I? As we start this week, we're going to consider 3 stories that answer that question differently and the problems that each of these stories face. And I'm going to tell you up front, this is going to be fairly heavy stuff this morning. I think maybe it gets easier later in the week. We're starting heavy, we're starting deep, because I know you're smart enough to think about it, even if it's challenging. So let's think about our first story. And the first story answers the question, who am I? With an answer we could summarize as thinking mud. So if you've got your camp notebooks there and you want to write down these points, that's our first point. Thinking mud. Now we're talking, like we were in the car here, about the evolutionary worldview. Yeah, we're going there. We've gone Genesis 1, evolutionary worldview. This is a story, a narrative that says that the human race is the product of blind evolutionary processes. That's who we are. Through random mutations in genetics that were selected for based on their adaptability in a particular environment over millions and billions of years. You just phased out for that bit, that's fine. But we've ended up as the upright ape known as Homo sapiens. Really, that means we're just uppity monkeys whose overactive brains developed as a kind of Swiss Army knife to environmental problems. And this has led, because of our big brains, to have grand ideas of ourselves. That's why we ask questions like, who am I? But ultimately, we're just the product of random chance and matter as they interact with the laws of physics. As a result, whatever predispositions we might have to cooperate within our species or to ethics, which may, after all, have just been programmed into us by natural selection as a kind of survival technique, our moral choices are as arbitrary as our genetics. It's as random as that. We're just one species of animal among many. And in fact, our capacity to destroy our own environment and the environments of other animals makes us look like a pretty self-destructive, parasitic animal at that. Though our brains enable us to self-reflect and think about things, we're no better and no more important than any other life form, or ultimately any other combination of chemicals. You might even have heard of people who believe this story and think that the world will be a lot better off without us, because it might give all the other species a better chance of survival if we weren't here mining oil and chopping down rainforests and things like that. But what's the problem with this story? Now, I'm not talking about the evidential problem. There's a lot of evidence for it. We're not debating that now. We can carry out that on in the car, can't we? I'm talking about whether or not this story serves. You know, is it fit for purpose? Does it match what we see in the world? Does it match what we know? Does it match the way the world is? Does it match how we are? And this story, you probably know this, it's behind much of the thought and the arguments that we've had in society over the last 200 years and more. It's used to justify things like abortion and euthanasia and sexual liberation, because if all we are as human beings is thinking mud, a hairless ape, or some of us are hairier than others, then what does it really matter? You like that, didn't you? Depending on your view, you might think that it's a good story. You might think, and maybe some of you believe it, you think that it's a story that increases human freedom. It sets us free from the oppression and limitations of religion or morality. But the problem with this story is that the same argument used to say how abortion or euthanasia or sexual liberation or a raft of other things aren't bad, takes away our ability to say that anything is good. If it's true, then there simply is no foundation for morality, for a belief in good and evil, other than what any individual chooses. Evolutionary adaptability, by the way, isn't even a value that we can have, because genetic adaptability in the interests of the creatures carrying those genes are two different and separate things. And if you want to know what that means, talk to me afterwards. Ultimately, according to this story, nothing we do matters in the grand scheme of things. Life is pointless, and the universe doesn't care. Human life, therefore, does not matter. We might think, if we believe this, that we should pursue a life of comfort and pleasure. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. You might think that the best way to do that is to avoid causing anyone else difficulty, because that's the best way to get on with it yourself. You might think that, say, suicide is preferable to an existence in which suffering is ultimately inevitable. If you live long enough, you will suffer. So what's the best way to avoid it? But ultimately, this story provides no basis for any ideological system or belief other than nihilism. That's another long word. It means the idea that nothing matters. There's no meaning to anything. There's no purpose. And I hope you all know this morning that things do matter. You matter. I mean, it might not always feel that way, but you here this morning, God's brought you here to heed his words. You matter. You have value. You are important. And our choices matter. Our choices have value. That's true of every human being. Some of you are probably thinking this. Last week's attacks in Southport were described by one journalist as unholy. And I agree with that journalist. But I wonder how we as a nation can consistently hold views while simultaneously holding that all life is stinking mud, saying it's unholy to kill children, but we're just mud that has the capacity to think. It doesn't match, does it? Why are we so appalled when human beings murder other human beings? Why? Whether it's children at a dance club or thousands in Gaza or Myanmar or wherever, why are we horrified? Why do we, as an international community, bring about sanctions on countries that do these things? Why do we know that it's wrong? That it's evil? Why is racism wrong? Why is the abuse of women wrong? After all, we're just apes, aren't we? What will any of this matter? Any of these choices matter in a million years' time? Everything is ultimately meaningless, isn't it? The big problem with this story is that no one really believes it. Most people who say they do don't live as if it was true. That means they're hypocrites. And I, for one, am profoundly grateful for that fact. Because if they were living out what they say they believed, we would be living in hell. We know, don't we, that there was more to us than that. So let's look at another story. Here's the second story. Who am I? Well, we could answer that by saying we're feeling mud. Okay, we're not thinking mud, we're feeling mud. Now, this is more like a big umbrella describing a whole raft of different stories rather than a single view. And many people who believe in it would agree with a lot of the previous story, at least in terms of evolution perhaps being a theory of how we got here. Now, others might bring in all kinds of other spiritual views to explain that, but either way, they rightly point out the depth and reality of human emotions. They say, look, we have a lot of feelings, don't we? And they use that to highlight our value. We must matter. If we can feel such love and such sadness, we've got to have value. But this story goes slightly off, and it says that true reality is found in our feelings. The answer to the question, who am I? We answer that not by looking out into the natural world or even into evolutionary theory or anything like that, but we look inside ourselves. My feelings about what I am will tell me who I am. If I feel that I'm female when I'm biologically male, then that is my reality. That's true for me. If I'm attracted to people of the same sex as me, then I'm gay, and that's my reality. No one else can tell me what is true, because truth is determined by what I feel, and that's subjective. They don't know what I feel. Only I know that. And you can see, I think, why this story is attractive, can't you? Whoever I am by nature, whoever I was born to be, that's fine. That's just me. I don't need to feel any guilt or shame about my feelings. That's my own personal reality. And we don't want to feel guilt or shame. That feels horrible. We're all just feeling mud, or we could give it a more attractive spin and say we're emotional stardust or emotive stardust or something like that. Each of us is just working out what our own truth is. But what's the problem with this story? Now, maybe you've already thought up a few. For one thing, if truth is purely subjective, that's purely personal, then what about when these truths collide? When one person's truth doesn't fit with another person's truth? Reality and morality being determined by our feelings, it sounds initially attractive. And the truth is that most people are fairly pleasant and law-abiding. So you think, well, if everyone's kind of working out who they are and they're all just sort of nice people, we'll have a nice world to live in. But how are we supposed to deal with people whose feelings are obviously destructive, either to themselves or to others? So if I've got a friend who struggles so much that they want to end their life, their truth is that they have no value and they'd be better off dead and everyone else will be better off as well. And I don't want them to end their life, and I try to persuade them otherwise, that they have value and they should continue living. Am I violating their truth? Am I not respecting them as a person? Because their feeling that their life isn't worth living doesn't align with my feeling that their continued existence is a good thing. And again, we're thinking, if someone feels they should go to a place and start indiscriminately killing children, isn't that just their truth? Now, what starts as a very positive sounding view, and it does sound really positive, that we can be whatever we feel ourselves to be, we can be whatever we want to be, it very quickly becomes a nightmarish picture where we are fragmented into 6 billion isolated individuals, 6 billion little islands, 6 billion little microcosms, where everyone is focused on themselves rather than everyone else. And we're back in hell, aren't we? Back in a place where truth is so particular to each individual person that you can never truly understand anyone else. You can never truly walk a mile in their shoes. You're in a very lonely place. To say that we are what we feel we are assumes that our feelings can never be wrong, that we can never be deluded, or that illness can never impair our ability to think straight. Maybe that illustration already brought this to mind, but most people these days are rightly aware of, and we're speaking about, aren't we, our mental health issues, where our perceptions and feelings about the world can go wonky and unhelpful, and we need maybe therapy or medication or just friends to help us see things as they really are, help see the truth outside of our own deluded thoughts. But can we draw a line between mental illness or any other kind of pathology, something that is wrong and ought not to be? Can we draw a line between that and a person's own truth and identity? Now, you might just say, it's clearly those things that make a person happy and well-adjusted, and mental illness gets in the way of that. It stops them from being happy and well-adjusted. But what about those people who seem to find happiness in hurting or even killing other people? Is a serial killer just living his own best life? This story that we are feeling mud doesn't match the way the world is. What sounds like it's elevating human value and freedom is in fact cheapening and destroying it. So what's the alternative? Well, we've already read it in Genesis. Human beings are not thinking mud. We are not feeling mud. We are image-bearing mud. Does that surprise you? We'll get to that. Now, if we've been going to church or mixing with Christians for a while, you've probably heard the idea of humans being God's image bearers. You've probably heard that before. But you might not know what it means, and that's okay. I guess we have a vague sense, don't we, that it makes humans somehow significant. If we're made in God's image, we must have a value or importance. The way I think sometimes it's used when discussing things like abortion and euthanasia, it would kind of make it more like a label in the back of a T-shirt or, a sticker on a sandwich in the works fridge. It's a way of saying this doesn't belong to you, so you don't get to do what you want with it. This belongs to someone else, look after it. That's not wrong, by the way. Maybe you'll talk about that tonight in tent prayers. But this story is so much better than that, and we see this in Genesis chapter 1. In this story, and this is the Bible's story, humanity is created by God, like we saw, on the 6th day of creation. Now, how many days did it take God to make the world? Simple Sunday school question. Shout it out. 6, thank you. Some of you maybe said 7, I didn't hear it. He took 6, didn't he? On the 7th day he rested. God made the world in 6 days. But that means that we were made on the last day. Men and women are, in fact, the last thing that God made. That's not because they're the least important, like as an afterthought. It's because we are the most important. Mankind are like the cherry on the cake of God's creation. When you look at this passage, you see that the entire world is created for mankind. It is manufactured as the perfect habitat for them to live in. See in verse 28 how God gives the whole earth to the man and the woman and their descendants. That means the whole earth belongs to us, and it's there for us to enjoy. More than that, it's there for them to rule over. Now this is incredible. Maybe you don't know this. Maybe you've heard it so many times it doesn't seem special. If you were to read chapter 2, verse 7, and you already thought the reading was long enough without reading through to chapter 2, verse 7, but we read that man was made out of the dust of the ground. Okay? The woman, verse 22, is made from the man, taken out of his side. That means they're made of the same stuff. There's an equality there. They're the same. The man is not made of a different stuff to the woman. They're the same thing. But this is also, isn't it, the same stuff that's used to make all the animals. 2 verse 19. They're made out of the dust of the ground. Who am I? I am mud. I am dirt. I am earth. That sounds pretty lowly, doesn't it? That's how I used it in the first 2 points, wasn't it? To say that we're lowly, we're mud. But look at our form, our function. In the ancient world, just like now, there were lots of different stories explaining where we've come from and who we are. It usually explained that mankind was created to serve the gods. The gods were doing their god partying stuff, and then they're like, this is too much like hard work. We need something to do the gardening and do all the heavy lifting and get us food, make us clothes. So they create man. So basically, men and women were created to be slaves. But in these other stories, there was another category of person, kings. Okay? Now, kings, they were understood. They weren't quite human. They were descendants from the gods. Maybe they were part god, part man, but there was some god back in the way. They were sometimes being described, by the way, as being made in the image of the gods, descended from the gods in their image. That means they looked like them. Maybe they were taller than the other people. I don't know. So when we read these words in Genesis 1:26, that we are made, mankind, the whole species, in the image of God, there's a few things that it is teaching us. We see our original identity. That means the source of our identity in how God makes us in his likeness. Did you notice? Matt read it for us. All the animals and plants are made according to their kinds. There are dogs and cats and lizards and trees and shrubs and fish and fungi. It's a whole kingdom. I love that. Fungi is a kingdom. It's a whole thing to itself. They are all part of, animal, vegetable, and mineral. Fungi got its own thing going on. That's great. But they are all part of a kind, aren't they, that shares a likeness with all the other similar species of their kind. That means there's a cat kind that's kind of all cat-like, and there's a dog kind, and there's fish kind, and there's bush kind and tree kind. The list goes on of all the different kinds that are like, here's a little group of things. They're all kind of like each other. Well, mankind, male and female, so when I say mankind, I mean all of us, men and women, whatever age you are, we are the only thing made in God's likeness. That means he is the closest thing to us in all the universe. It ain't apes. We're made in the likeness of God. But we also see our functional identity. That means what our identity should drive us to do. This is the purpose of our identity. That's rule as kings on the earth. We weren't made, says the Bible, to be slaves. That is not what we were made for. We weren't made to serve even some higher, other category of human being like kings. Men and women were all made to be kings. Each one of us was intended to rule over the earth and care for it like a good king should. It was given for us to enjoy, for us to beautify. Mud might well be the stuff that makes up our bodies. The same matter is everything else around us. You eat a beef burger and it becomes part of your body, doesn't it? But who am I? I am not a beef burger, no matter how many of them I eat. I am an image bearer of God. I exist to display him to all creation, to serve him by ruling over the earth that he has given to me. But I'm going to be fair this morning. What's the problem with this story? It sounds attractive, doesn't it? A kind of rags to riches story. A Cinderella starting out in the dust and ending up in a palace. In a mud king. That's great, isn't it? But why is the world such a mess if this story is true? Because it is a mess, isn't it? Well, unlike the false stories that we've already looked at, which pretend there isn't a problem with the way they see the world, the Bible actually supplies the answer itself. We look out in the world, and while humans are capable of incredible, wonderful things, and I'm not just talking about the amazing engineering we can see, those submarines we make down in Barrow, or the works of art and music that we can produce. But what about the love and kindness that we can show, the warmth and tenderness that we enjoy? And this is only seen in the animal world in a really fragmented way. We are different, and it's wonderful, isn't it, what humans can do? But there's something wrong with this picture. We're also capable, like we've all seen in the news this week, of appalling evil. We have messed up the world around us. We were made to be kings, but we've abused that power and each other. And we've used the greatest minds that mankind has ever produced to do some of the most appalling and unspeakable things. Image-bearing mud. That's a story. And it's a story that sin has spoiled. Who am I? Now, maybe having heard all this, you just don't feel any closer to knowing the answer. But just as the Bible points out the problem that our sin creates in our image-bearing role, it also offers a solution. We're thinking about this throughout the week, so I don't want to say too much about it. Everyone knows, I think, that the answer is Jesus. It always is Jesus. You know, sometimes in Sunday school we try and trick you, and it's not. But eventually we get there, don't we? Jesus is the answer. But something really interesting is the idea that mankind, male and female equally, were made as God's image bearers. That means we were made to represent him and continue his work in the world, like we're meant to be little gods on the earth. Important as this is for the Old Testament, and it's right here in the beginning of the Bible. This is foundational. Page 1, image bearers of God. That doesn't really appear in the New Testament. Does that surprise you? I think partly it's because the Old Testament says it and we don't need to repeat it. But partly it's because that idea gets an upgrade, gets a new set of clothes. Sin ruins the likeness of God in us. That doesn't mean it takes it away. It's still there. But the devil's constantly trying to distort it and get us to live in any way, accept any story which will avoid us looking the way we were meant to. Who am I? I am a king, and so are you. But we have an enemy who wants us to live in the mud that God drew us out of. Our common humanity, every one of us, wonderful as we are, there's a corruption that we all share. And so in Jesus, God the Son came, as we read in Romans 8, verse 3, in the likeness of sinful flesh. It's a really important use of the word likeness. He died as a sin offering, the same verse tells us, to pay the price of our disobedience and redeem the likeness that sin had spoiled. It was like buying back a piece of art and fixing it. He rose to make a way for men and women to be friends with God, to fulfill the plan that God had right from the beginning. This is not plan B. We are still living plan A. Because the New Testament might not have much to say about our being created in the likeness of God, but it sure has a lot to say about Christians being conformed to the likeness of Christ. Just read Romans 8:29, maybe not now. The world just does not have a satisfactory answer to the question, who am I? It has answers that we might like the sound of until we dig a little deeper, or until life shows us how disappointing and empty those answers are. Only the Bible can make sense of the beautiful ruins that our human nature is, and also offer us a solution to the desperate mess that our mistakes have put us in. Which story, I'm not asking for a show of hands, which story do you believe? However you answer, there are implications for how you live consistently with that. The stories we tell give away a lot about us. Do you know who you are this morning? Let's sing our final hymn.